Our story begins in the city of Solon, a peaceful and balanced place. Business was bustling, and new people arrived every day. But one newcomer was especially happy to be there. He was a world traveler who, after having his old body destroyed, reincarnated into a new one. And he had incredible luck. This new body belonged to a noble family. Because the family name was famous and respected, he was well received everywhere. This meant the traveler could start a new life without fear. He took a deep breath, determined to change the world. But soon after, things started to get tense. The local ruler read the protagonist his father's will. From time to time, he mentioned the name Wenger, who was the heir. The protagonist was eager to understand what it all meant. Richard, the protagonist in this body of work, was afraid to hear that he would receive nothing. After a dramatic pause, the ruler made a proposal. He suggested that Richard renounce his surname. In exchange, his half-brother would give him a small financial compensation. The ruler made a sign, and a chest was brought into the hall. They opened it in front of Richard and showed him a pile of gold coins. Richard wasn't sad at all. In fact, he saw an advantage in it. Seeing the protagonist's calm reaction, the ruler thought he had solved the problem easily. But then Richard gave a sly laugh. He said that the family name was very dear to him, and not just because of the memories. The ruler decided to test Richard's intentions. With a sly smile, Richard demanded much more money. The ruler was baffled by the audacity. Even so, he was willing to pay. Suddenly, a coin was tossed into the air, clinking. Richard accepted the new terms without complaint. Immediately afterward, the protagonist changed the subject and began talking about barbarian slaves. The ruler became interested and soon realized Richard wanted to buy them to form his own army. Even after warning that this was dangerous, Richard confirmed that this was exactly the plan. The ruler, not wanting to interfere, agreed and ordered the protagonist to be taken to the Colosseum to choose his merchandise. Deep down, the ruler actually liked Richard's manner. The scene then changed to the street, where the carriage was passing by. Comfortable inside, Richard hummed a tune. It was a ballad about journeys he didn't even know where they came from. Along the way, Richard remembered how he started in this world. Thanks to the Lord system, he managed to survive and improve his skills. Initially, he had other plans, but thanks to the follies of the body's former owner, his depraved father, he acquired a noble surname. For someone living on the streets, that was pure happiness. The first thing Richard did was run out of the ancient city. His thoughts were interrupted when the carriage stopped suddenly. He looked up and saw the gigantic walls of the Colosseum. Once inside, he went straight to the subject of slaves. He said he wanted to buy some and that he had permission from the ruler. The manager of the place was somewhat annoyed, as he thought Richard had only gone there to watch the fights. The manager warned that the fighters there were ferocious. As they walked, Richard passed cages containing various strange creatures. The manager introduced the monsters, highlighting how skilled hunters they were. Richard observed everything with interest, even thinking he could tame those beasts. Of course, this crazy idea frightened the manager, but Richard made it clear that he was the one in charge there and that he planned to bring the best barbarians available. After all, nobody knew that Richard had an ace up his sleeve, the so-called system, which was invisible to the others. After activating a system function, Richard climbed onto the podium. From up there, he saw the group of slaves and began to speak to them. Richard explained that he had bought them all. He spoke openly about their fate as slaves, but made a bold proposition. He offered them freedom if they could defeat him. After saying this, Richard jumped down from above, looking gleeful. He landed on the ground with a thud and shouted, "If I win, you fight for me." Suddenly, the crowd of slaves parted to make way. One of them stepped forward, interested in Richard's talk about fighting. The manager held his breath because he recognized who it was. Russell, the barbarian, was walking stubbornly toward Richard. Russell warned Richard not to cry when he lost. Richard simply gestured with his hand, beckoning the barbarian to attack. The manager watched everything from the balcony, desperate. She yelled at Richard, warning him that Russell was the strongest of them all. She tried to call the protagonist's companion over to talk some sense into him, but it was no use. The fight was going to happen. The manager was paralyzed by what was happening. She couldn't let a nobleman die in her arena under any circumstances. Meanwhile, the other barbarians laughed, betting on how long the rich boy would last. Russell, the barbarian, had already vowed to show no mercy. He charged forward and stretched out those gigantic hands toward the protagonist. He grabbed Richard by the shoulders and delivered a brutal headbutt. Without wasting a moment, he changed his movement, gripped Richard's clothing tightly, and letting out a roar, threw the boy to the ground with all his might. The force Russell used was monstrous, raising a wave of dust in the arena. Richard looked dead. The barbarian laughed when it was over, because he had hoped the aristocrat would resist at least a little longer. The fun had ended in a fraction of a second. The other barbarians admired Russell's brute strength, while the manager nearly fainted. If Richard died, the fine she would have to pay would be unaffordable. But then, a hand gripped Russell's leg tightly. The barbarian stopped, looked back, and was shocked to see Richard getting up. The protagonist surprised everyone with this resurrection. Richard raised his fist and a second later brought down the giant. Russell couldn't understand how the aristocrat was still in one piece after that beating. What he didn't know was that, thanks to years of training, Richard possessed magical powers, and the nobleman wanted more of a fight. The barbarian bared his teeth, stood up quickly, already cursing everyone and everything. At that same moment, Richard grabbed his hand, pulled him, and threw him to the ground again. Victory for Richard, but the barbarian was stubborn and wouldn't accept defeat. Russell wanted another round of practice. Richard smiled and accepted the challenge. The other barbarians were completely baffled. How could Richard beat one of them? As they watched the scene, they were surprised again. Richard repeated the technique and Russell fell to the ground once more. Bad luck struck the barbarian again, and he was beaten once more. Even with several consecutive defeats, Russell kept trying to get up, stubborn, barely able to move his tongue, trying to convince himself that he could still fight. Seeing his condition, the other barbarians shouted for him to give up. It was then that a penetrating yet gentle voice cut through the noise. A tall, full-breasted figure appeared, urging them to stop. She was a barbarian, and she was going to fight in Russell's place. Upon seeing her, the other barbarians began to shout excitedly. They knew that with the arrival of that cuckolded woman, the aristocrat's end was near. Richard turned to her. She giggled, gripping a chain tightly in her hands. She said she hoped the nobleman would keep his word if he lost. Richard assured her he was a man of his word. Hearing this, the barbarian charged forward with everything she had. The protagonist was alarmed. He hadn't expected her to be so fast. He glanced quickly at the system and saw that she was classified as hero level. A second later, Richard felt the impact of a powerful blow. He only managed to stay on his feet because he blocked at the right moment. Richard took a deep breath. It was the first time he had faced someone of this level. He was eager to test her strength. At that moment, the barbarian woman leaped, using all her might to crush the aristocrat. Richard leaped back, and the ground cracked exactly where her blow landed. The barbarians shouted in support of their companion. The manager wept, watching the arena being destroyed by the fight. The guard accompanying Richard frowned, surprised by the woman's strength. With the crowd cheering her on, the barbarian ripped a huge chunk of earth and stone from the ground, lifting it high in her hands. She aimed well and hurled the rock straight at Richard. The impact was violent, raising a huge cloud of dust. The manager couldn't bear to see so much destruction any longer and ran downstairs. Crying, she shouted that the barbarian had killed the nobleman. The other barbarians were overjoyed, already smelling the scent of freedom. Russell, on the other hand, was disappointed with Richard, feeling that his skills weren't up to par. But then, the enormous rock trembled, and a sound of something breaking came from below. Richard was alive and well, and to tell the truth, he even enjoyed being hit with a rock. This took everyone by surprise, including Barbara. She asked if Richard was ready to continue the game. The protagonist smiled, winked, and explained that brute force wasn't everything. That's when, out of nowhere, the barbarian ran around him. Using the chain from her own handcuffs, she wrapped it around the protagonist's neck and pulled hard. Richard couldn't hold on and fell. Standing before him, she wanted to hear the aristocrat admit defeat and give her the recognition she deserved. Richard tried to speak, but only a hiss came out. But, the moment the chain snapped, the protagonist admitted the woman before him was irresistible. Those watching were speechless. Russell couldn't believe what he was seeing. After all, with a single movement, Richard had broken the chains. The barbarian herself was confused, seeing her chains broken. Meanwhile, Richard stood up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and began to praise her qualities. The woman became furious when she realized that the aristocrat had only been pretending all this time. She took a deep breath and shouted, demanding that Richard fight with all his might. The protagonist nodded in agreement. Now it was serious. Everyone was ready to give their all. Richard attacked first, throwing a direct punch without breaking her defense right away. But the barbarian woman dodged. The other barbarians trembled at the sight. In speed, the aristocrat was far ahead of their companion. At one point, Richard's powerful hand pinned the barbarian to the ground. She kicked, tried to escape, but in the end had to accept defeat. At that moment, Richard raised his fist. Expecting death, the barbarian closed her eyes. But she remained alive. The blow only served to break the shackles on her wrists. She looked at her own hands, not quite understanding. Richard said it was a choice. Then he turned to the rest of the group. He gave the barbarians a choice: join him or be defeated. defeated. Then, the protagonist extended his hand to the barbarian woman. Without hesitating for a second, she gripped his hand tightly. Once on her feet, she spoke to the other barbarians. She pointed to Richard, knelt down, and called him the new leader. Finally, Richard himself spoke and officially introduced himself. After hearing everything, the barbarians reconsidered. They quickly discussed what had happened and unanimously decided to join Richard. The stadium manager watched everything, completely bewildered. The escort guard wasn't surprised. After all, Richard had a powerful last name. The protagonist turned around, and the system showed that a bunch of barbarians were sending requests to join him immediately. Of course, Richard accepted. From now on, his plans were grand. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. He wanted to create his own reality. With the workforce secured, the first step had been taken. Now, Richard went to a famous store in the city. He needed to equip his new army. The barbarians' eyes gleamed as they followed Richard into the shop, gazing in amazement at the clothes on display. The shop owner, Negan, greeted the staff. Richard got straight to the point. He wanted weapons. The dwarf winked mischievously and leaned against a random part of the wall. The pressure of his hand moved a discreet stone. At the same time, the sign outside changed, advertising weapons for sale. Before the astonished eyes of the barbarians, the shop itself began to transform. So, instead of clothes, the shelves were filled with swords and axes. Impressed by the quality, the barbarians began to pick up and examine everything. Richard analyzed the stock and began to tell each one which weapons they should use. When it came time to pay, Richard dumped a pile of coins on the table but sighed and admitted that he was out of money. The dwarf's demeanor changed instantly. He frowned, making it clear that he didn't do business with anyone who didn't have money. But Richard told Negan not to jump to conclusions and grabbed his own sword. Richard offered his luxurious weapon as payment. The dwarf was shocked when he saw the blade. It was the legendary Snake Killer. Realizing Richard was a powerful figure, the dwarf decided not to argue. He accepted the sword and agreed to give the aristocrats some credit. In response, Richard turned to his barbarians and ordered, "Take everything you need." With no other choice, the dwarf ordered the barbarians to be equipped. It was at this moment that the barbarian woman, now called Gunther, approached Richard, asking about the future. The protagonist smiled. Richard explained that the next step would be to retake their homeland. And so began the march of Richard's small army. He spent most of the journey with his face glued to the map, unaware that they were already being followed. Harson, the goblin chief, watched his victims from afar. A werewolf roared beside him, demanding half the loot. The goblins were not at all pleased with this demand. Harson decided not to fight now and just wait for the right moment to attack. The werewolf agreed, laughing loudly, already imagining the fight. Gunther heard this laughter in the distance and told Richard his suspicions, but the protagonist had already figured it all out. Then he gave orders to the barbarians. Richard called out some specific men and discreetly placed small bags in their hands containing something they were to swallow. One of the barbarians took a small ball out of the bag and looked at it suspiciously. Richard immediately invented a story that it was a foreign remedy to make them faster and stronger. Of course, it was a lie. In fact, he planned to strengthen the troops using the system. Taking advantage of the moment, he opened the upgrade menu. Richard analyzed the list. Only the horned barbarian, Gunther, appeared with the heroine status. He saw that the barbarian's evolution through the system would be very rapid and suspicious. That's precisely why he invented the story of the magic pills. After tossing a pill into the air and catching it, he assured the barbarians that it worked. Meanwhile, Harson watched the caravan come to a stop. The werewolf howled, eager for the massacre, but the goblin leader held him back. The werewolf thought the caravan was afraid of an ambush, but the goblin smiled. He suspected they suspected something, but that they wouldn't be able to resist in the end. So, Harson gave the order, attack with full force. A roar came from the mountain, drawing the protagonist's attention. The barbarians formed a defensive line. The werewolf leader ordered his brothers to advance, followed by the heavy noise of the trolls. A giant horde of creatures descended the slope toward the barbarians. Instead of fear, Richard was excited by the fun. He grabbed a spear and aimed. At the right moment, he threw it. The spear cut through the air in an unnatural way, leaving a trail of fire straight towards the goblin leader. It looked like a fatal blow, but Harson simply moved his hand and easily deflected the attack. He mocked their effort, deeming it weak. Then he ordered the monsters to advance at once. The goblin infantry came forward like an avalanche, frightening the barbarians who saw themselves with no chance of victory. The fighting began. The barbarians fought bravely, but it was no use. They fell one by one, surrounded. One of them tried to advance with a spear so as not to die ingloriously, but he couldn't couldn't even take a step. The battlefield turned into a bloody massacre. The barbarians bought by Richard were dying one after another. Gunther screamed desperately, asking the master what to do. In response, the protagonist simply asked, "Give me another spear." Richard explained that he didn't intend to kill all the enemies with his bare hands. He was looking for the perfect target. Suddenly, his gaze focused on something. Richard made a sharp movement, twisting his body to gain speed and preparing to strike. The tip of the spear began to heat up and caught fire. Gunther's eyes widened in surprise at what he saw. After applying the magic spell to the spear, Richard aimed and fired with full force. The shot was accurate. It hit a troll squarely in the head. This caused widespread panic among the enemy lines. The werewolves were the first to flee, terrified. The goblins and the rest of the troops followed without a second thought. Richard chuckled, remembering that old advice, always take down the biggest one first. The barbarians cheered at the scene and began shouting Richard's name. The advantage in the battle shifted completely in favor of the protagonist's army. Even the barbarians who were surrounded began to react and find openings. But not all the enemies had given up. The leader of the werewolves continued fighting desperately. Suddenly, a spear pierced the monster. It was Richard, who remained focused on eliminating the important targets. The barbarian who was fighting the werewolf breathed a sigh of relief, saved by his boss. With no more spears, Richard sheathed his sword, drew it, and ordered the barbarians to attack the fugitives. The final offensive had begun. Gunther was pleased to see through the strategy. Richard had been focused on the leaders the whole time. Only one was missing, the last leader of the gang, whom Richard had deliberately let slip by. At that moment, a goblin chattered his teeth nervously. It was Harson, the goblin leader. He was isolated and couldn't understand how his soldiers couldn't handle ordinary humans. Richard appeared before him, laughing and calling the goblins an inferior race. The goblin grinned back, trying to intimidate, saying that no one would come to help Richard there. The protagonist thanked him for the information and, with a sarcastic smile, apologized for the pain he would cause next. The goblin chief assumed a defensive stance when he saw the sword. Richard pointed the blade at Harson and smiled. A second later, the goblin leader was easily defeated. The other goblins trembled at the sight. It was the first time they had seen their chief lose. Gunther seized the shock and gave the order. With a war cry, the barbarians descended, slaughtering the goblins, who were paralyzed with fear. The panic was so great that the goblins didn't even try to defend themselves. At that moment, the system sent a notification to Richard. The barbarians had leveled up, and they truly felt the strength increasing during the fight. At the end of the battle, the barbarians even managed to subdue 2 trolls, which Richard decided to use as porters. Gunther approached, saying he had found a map with the goblin leader. Richard praised the horned woman for her find. After studying the map, Richard had an idea. He announced that the next stop would be a fortress in the high mountains. Shortly after, the journey continued. Richard noticed that the trolls were surprisingly resilient. Taking advantage of a moment of peace, he checked the system. He discovered that he earned points at the end of each battle, but he couldn't spend those points right now. Due to the limitations of his current body, he couldn't increase his brute strength, so he invested everything in his swordsmanship. Richard became so focused on this that he didn't even notice the time passing. Gunther warned that the fortress was very close. The protagonist ordered a break to rest, as the place was perfect for relaxing. Richard gave the barbarians a moment to catch their breath, but even during his time off, Gunther wouldn't leave him alone, trying to help with everything. At one point, Richard smelled her sweat and, speaking softly, commented on it. He told her to take care of herself and stop worrying about others for a moment. Somewhat embarrassed, Gunther thanked them for their kindness. She found a quiet spot and began to wash herself in the stream. For the first time, besides freedom, she felt a graceful lightness. The hours passed and night fell. Taking advantage of the darkness, Richard and his barbarians approached the fortress in silence. The plan was to take the place for themselves. Richard saw 2 kobold guards at the entrance. The barbarians stifled a laugh, finding those opposing creatures ridiculous. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, a love drama was unfolding. 2 kobolds were discussing their relationship and feelings, but the romance was abruptly cut short when Richard stormed in. Richard announced immediately the fortress was taken. The other kobolds had already been neutralized, but the fortress leader didn't want to surrender easily and began threatening Richard, saying that punishment would come swiftly. But cut to an hour later, the governor was already profusely apologizing to Richard. After hearing enough, the protagonist ordered Gunther to release the man. And what's more, he ordered him to go. Obediently, Gunther cut the rope. As soon as he was free, the kobold leader ran off, but not before casting hateful glances, promising silent revenge. When the the dust settled, Richard began to assess the conquest. He thought that place would make a perfect hideout. The defenses were excellent. If the fortress had been at full strength, it would have been very difficult to take. Then Richard looked at the map again and summoned the barbarians for a mission. He explained that the kobolds' threats about a nearby army were real and that they would come to attack the new refuge. One of the barbarians didn't understand anything. If you knew that, why did you release their leader? Richard smiled and began to talk about profit. He took out some coins, tossed them into the air, caught them, and slammed them on the table over the map. The plan was simple: lure everyone in to take down the kobolds all at once. They had barely begun to eat and rest when a sentry arrived, warning that an enemy detachment had appeared in the vicinity. Richard jumped up, calling the battle a guaranteed profit. The protagonist ordered everyone to prepare. The battle seemed won, with the barbarians mocking the defeated goblins. When the ground began to shake, boom, an explosion of earth erupted. A creature emerged from the hole, steam spitting out its mouth. A barbarian gritted his teeth and whispered, "Goblin dragon." They explained that it was a rare type of goblin with dragon blood in its veins. With a roar from him, dozens of other goblins sprouted from the ground like ants. Gunther warned Richard that this creature was no joke, and that goblin dragon wouldn't stop talking and boasting. The earth cracked open again and something gigantic appeared. The goblin was riding a colossal lizard. The barbarians were shocked. Mounted on the beast, the goblin taunted, saying he would punish the insolent in the name of dragon's blood. Gunther, with no patience for idle chatter, charged forward and threw his spear with all his might. But the weapon struck the lizard in the forehead and ricocheted. For the first time, Gunther's brute force failed. The goblin laughed in her face, saying that victory wouldn't be so easy. Gunther realized she was in a bind. Luckily, Richard arrived in time. He ran and grabbed the giant lizard's paw. The protagonist's grip was absurd. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, sinking the earth with the pressure. Using all his body strength, Richard pulled the lizard, let out a yell, and threw the creature aside. The lizard flipped over and fell with a thud, scattering a pool of blood. Seeing that display of strength, the goblin stood paralyzed, completely bewildered. Once again, Richard proved that he was absurdly strong. The remaining special goblin couldn't understand how this was possible. Laughing, Richard approached and suggested that he surrender, but the goblin was quick, grabbed his axe, gripped the handle tightly, and roared that he would never surrender. Richard's response? A sharp slap across his face. That was how he dealt with the monster's audacity. Problem solved. The protagonist adjusted his cloak. The job was done. With some free time, Richard went back to tinkering with the system. He loved seeing his people leveling up. Super focused, he began distributing the new abilities to the barbarians. Minutes later, the barbarians showed off the spoils of war, but the money they found was meager, and no one was very happy. Richard sighed understandingly. He knew that hard times were complicated for everyone. Then, attention turned to the captured lizard. Richard licked his lips, wondering aloud if the creature's meat was tasty. But he traded his hunger for mercy and decided to use the lizard as a mount. Everything settled, Gunther insisted they return to the fortress. Time passed and it was already daylight. Suddenly, Richard was breathless with excitement. The system store had finally been unlocked. Unable to resist, he made a purchase on the spot. Out of nowhere, a spear began to materialize in midair. When the process was complete, the weapon fell directly into his hands. Gunther saw that magic happen, but Richard didn't even notice. He was distracted. A scout arrived, reporting that he had seen a group of werewolves robbing someone. Richard picked up his spyglass and looked in the indicated direction. He saw a wealthy caravan that had fallen into a trap. He immediately suspected that this was no ordinary caravan. The protagonist thought that local businessmen could be useful in the future. Meanwhile, the werewolves demanded the bags of money in exchange for their lives. The merchant tried to warn them not to use violence, threatening to call the army. The werewolves burst into laughter. They were bandits and feared no army. Suddenly, the guards ordered the merchant to flee, but the poor fellow couldn't even take 2 steps. He was surrounded and was ready to hand over the money. But the werewolf wasn't interested in talking anymore. He wanted blood. At the last second, Richard's new spear pierced the mangy creature. The beast howled in terrible pain. The rest of the pack was in shock. Richard watched with satisfaction. The spear worked like a charm. Then came Gunther's cry, ordering the attack. A wall of barbarians charged against the werewolves. Richard decided not to participate in the fight, only to watch. The combat began, and the bloodlust and menacing posture of the barbarians was exactly what he wanted to see. He realized his army could defeat anyone. Losing the battle, many werewolves tried to flee. Panic spread, as did rumors about the barbarians who had destroyed the alliance between goblins and werewolves. After that, they began to speak fearfully of a certain person, Richard, the legendary lord of the wildlands. The escape of the remaining werewolves was only a matter of time. But even fleeing didn't save them. Richard's lizard emerged from the ground, tearing apart and throwing werewolves everywhere. The protagonist was satisfied. He no longer needed to worry about the potential of his army. Soon a barbarian announced that the last bandit had been eliminated. The battle ended and the civilians emerged from their hiding places, overjoyed with the unexpected help. Richard had already made his intentions clear. The best reward for saving them would be cash. One of the rescued women had already expected this gesture from a nobleman. That's when an elf appeared in the carriage. She got off the bus and introduced herself as Annie, also introducing the man behind her, named Ruto. She bowed in gratitude to her rescuers. Richard smiled and began praising his barbarians. Suddenly, Annie asked the protagonist for help. Intrigued, Richard asked her to repeat herself. The elf showed the caravan the deplorable state after the attack. She wanted Richard's temporary protection. The protagonist didn't hesitate to help, but made it clear there would be a price. As soon as she heard that, Annie sent Ruto to fetch something. A minute later, a screen opened in front of Richard, revealing a hidden sphere. Suddenly, Annie threw the sphere into the air. The sphere floated above the ground, and the elf explained that it was for communication. The news was that reinforcements for the caravan wouldn't arrive for another 3 days. Richard gave a mischievous smile, increasingly convinced that this caravan held valuable secrets. In the end, the protagonist offered help. Annie, with little choice, entrusted her life to Richard. A few hours later, the scene shifted back to the mountain fortress. The elf was busy preparing healing potions. Just looking at her, Richard was alarmed. Annie wasn't making just any little potion, but legendary ones. With just one vial of that stuff, Richard could easily buy a second army of barbarians. He couldn't get that out of his head until nightfall. In the middle of the night, there on the walls, Annie was informed that the caravan had lost many people. The news shook the elf's heart. Ruto added that many had only survived thanks to Richard. Since the subject was him, Annie wanted to know Ruto's opinion. Ruto highlighted Richard's courage. After all, he went to help without hesitation at a moment that seemed lost. Furthermore, Ruto was impressed by the profit the Lord's soldiers were generating, easily defeating experienced bandits. In short, they were only alive because of him. Meanwhile, the protagonist himself was thinking about protecting the caravan, which seemed far more impressive than his rag-clad barbarians. Besides, the barbarians were noisy and fought over dividing the loot. In any case, luck smiled on Richard. In a short time, he achieved a great deal without spending almost anything, and his barbarians continued to evolve. These pleasant thoughts were interrupted by Gunther's shouts calling for the chief. Relaxed in his chair, Richard didn't understand the panic. The barbarian warned that a large group of warriors was coming towards the fortress. Gunther noticed that they were half-human, and indeed, the sound of hooves echoed in the night. Heavily armed centaurs marched without stopping. Ahead of them came a figure wielding a sword. Soon, the centaurs reached the fortress walls, led by Heather, the clan chief. The wait didn't last long, because the tip of a spear gleamed in the darkness. Heather spotted the weapon flying just in time. Soon after, 10 more spears flew towards the centaurs. They dug into the ground very close to them. Heather understood the message. They had missed on purpose. Even so, she didn't call off the attack. Richard grinned maliciously, watching the centaurs ignore the warning. Then he ordered another round of spears. This time, one was aimed directly at Heather herself. She drew her sword and cut the spear in half as it flew. After that, she ordered her soldiers to stop. With a hint of shame, she reached into her bag and pulled out a white cloth. She tied the cloth to a piece of broken spear and began to wave it. Seeing this, Gunther warned. The enemy was surrendering. Richard decided to go down to negotiate personally, but left plenty of men on guard at the fortress. He arrived quickly to where they were. Heather bowed and introduced herself. Richard did the same and sheathed his sword. Upon hearing the protagonist's name, Heather couldn't resist asking if the rumors were true. Richard was surprised that they had already heard of him. Heather said that Richard's adventures were known in many places. Richard felt flattered, but pretended that much of it was a lie. Then Heather took out a sign with inscriptions and handed it to Richard, saying it was important news. The protagonist took it, looked at it, but didn't understand anything that was written. Heather explained briefly that the locals wanted to create their own army. Gunther approached quickly. The barbarian could read the language on the sign and translated. The kobolds planned to expel Richard from the fortress. The news of the attack didn't faze the protagonist in the slightest. Heather tried to explain that things were serious, since the kobolds had even lured shamans to their side. But the big question remained. What did the centaurs want with all this? Out of the blue, Heather offered help on behalf of her clan. Richard Richard found it strange and asked why. Heather was direct. She would never side with criminals. She explained that, in ancient times, centaurs were known for being peaceful and hardworking. With Richard's support, she wanted to bring those times back. As soon as she said that, the system sent an alliance notification to Richard. And there's more. The centaurs were experts in ranged attacks. Richard accepted and opened the gates of the fortress for them. Inside, he delivered the bad news to the staff. Annie broke out in a cold sweat of fear. Relaxing in his chair, Richard warned that the fight was about to begin. The elf was terrified and asked when the problems would arrive. Richard thought for a moment and guessed a time frame, 10 days. The merchants panicked, but the barbarians were excited by the chance of a good fight. Heather tried to calm things down, saying that the enemy army was still disorganized. Richard accepted the information and wasted no time. He ordered preparations to begin immediately. Soon after, he gathered the group to explain the strategy. Everyone was curious, but Richard kept the details of the plan a secret. First of all, he had a request for the elf. Annie looked at him with a tired expression. Richard, with utter audacity, asked for a large cash loan. She agreed without a second thought. Richard bowed in thanks and turned to Heather. He discovered that she commanded the best archers in the region. Using the system store, Richard bought new ammunition for the army and gave Heather a special bow. The centaur was shocked, thinking the aristocrat knew how to use magic. She decided to test the gift. She knocked the arrow, pulled the string, and aimed. She held her breath for a few seconds and then released it. The arrow sliced through the air and struck a tree, lodging a wasp in the trunk. Richard was pleased with the demonstration. He already knew how the centaurs would increase their chances of victory. Heather also loved the expensive gift. Richard stood there, admiring her training, but the atmosphere turned heavy when Ruto arrived looking exhausted. He warned that the caravan's reinforcements had been attacked. Richard couldn't ignore this. They went to the scene and saw that the ambush had been brutal. The reinforcements had been destroyed. Annie was devastated. Richard examined the massacre scene and suggested that Annie and the merchants go to town immediately, but she refused at once. The elf didn't want to run away and abandon the wounded to their fate. Hearing this, Richard smiled. He agreed to continue protecting the caravan, but, of course, he increased the price of the service. Grumbling, Annie accepted the new conditions. At that moment, Heather noticed a strange spear in the protagonist's hands and commented that it looked like a homemade weapon. Richard doubted that savages could forge weapons, but Annie explained that there were many different tribes, especially those in the north. These natives were robust warriors, with a history of thousands of battles, and skilled blacksmiths. Heather concluded that the reinforcements must have been attacked by those natives, and Annie agreed. Richard didn't even bother to think about it. Gunther, who was itching to fight, supported her boss. The protagonist liked the barbarian's attitude and the idea of confronting everyone at once. And so, 10 days passed. At the mountain fortress, training didn't stop for a minute. Suddenly, the scouts warned, enemy in sight. Richard wanted to know the distance. They said there was a giant camp nearby and that the attack was supposed to happen the next day. Smiling, Richard said, "That's exactly the moment I've been waiting for." Shortly after, the trumpets sounded in the fortress. Richard drew his sword, prepared his army, and let out a war cry, calling everyone to battle. The barbarians responded with shouts of approval. The ranks parted and the centaurs galloped forward. This time, Richard himself decided to use protection. Feeling the weight of the armor for the first time, Annie appeared wanting to know what the plan was. Richard explained that he would launch a surprise attack to break the enemy's morale. The others thought the idea was a bit dirty, but Richard told them not to worry and to trust him. The scene shifted to the valley below, where one of the military leaders was observing. The werewolf wanted to organize a counterattack immediately, but the kobold ruler urged calm, warning that Richard was a very strong opponent. The werewolf wasn't very convinced and pointed to the gigantic army behind him. At that exact moment, Richard began a speech, shouting and calling the savages cowards and insignificant. Provoked, the werewolf commander sent his troops into battle. Seeing this, Richard signaled to Heather. Immediately, the centaurs unleashed a rain of arrows. The arrows struck the first ranks of the savages squarely. When the armies drew close to one another, Richard's lizard charged forward. The savages tried to throw spears, but the points didn't even scratch the creature's thick skin. Finally, the two armies clashed. Suddenly, amidst the chaos, the ground cracked open. Out emerged a goblin dragon in broad daylight. Richard reacted quickly and changed the direction of his mount. He gave a command and made the lizard leap, landing with all its weight right in the center of the enemy army. Taking advantage of the chaos, Richard pierced a special goblin with his weapon. The other barbarians followed suit. While the protagonist fought on the front lines, Gunther took command of the rest. Soon, the battlefield battlefield was a bloodbath, but the savages were not willing to surrender. A heavily armed group went straight for Richard. He took up a defensive position, but the impact was so great that his weapon broke and he was thrown from atop the lizard. Luckily, he landed on his feet and unharmed. He even admitted that those savages with hammers were good fighters. Without wasting any time, Richard picked up a trident from the ground to intercept the attacks. Quick as lightning, he blocked the first enemy, swung his trident, and counterattacked, taking down another savage. The protagonist moved like a machine, showing no emotion on his face. Even the barbarians were impressed by his coldness and strength. The battle continued, and the ranks of the savages were dwindling. The enemy commanders were shocked by the turn of events and decided to take drastic measures. They summoned the shamans. Dressed in bone robes and illuminated by fire, the shamans began to cast a spell. The magic words turned into a strange song until they awakened something. The leaders of the savage army were encouraged, believing that the barbarians would now be destroyed. Richard didn't miss what was happening. A ball of fire was flying through the sky toward them. That force was controlled by one of the shamans and, suddenly, it took the form of a fire dragon. Richard turned and shouted for the army to prepare. A second later, the magic crashed onto the battlefield, creating an absurd flash. The power of it impressed even Richard. Immediately afterward, several fireballs began to fall, one after the other. For the first time, Richard was wounded, and a shadow of doubt crossed his face. He needed to find a way to take that power away from the enemy. He recalled that the shaman controlled everything with a staff. That's when Heather arrived to help. Richard was happy to see her, as he already had a plan for the archer. He pointed at the shaman and demanded, "Shoot him." Heather understood immediately and gave the order to her centaurs. They all prepared their bows. Heather herself prepared to shoot. In an instant, the sky darkened with a rain of arrows. The enemy army command realized the danger. Seeing that the shaman was in their sights, they sent warriors with shields to protect him. The werewolf leader was already celebrating, thinking he had saved the wizard. But Richard didn't stand still. At the same time, he hurled his spear with full force. The werewolf didn't even see where it came from. When the spear hit its target, it stopped breathing instantly. A second later, it realized it had a hole in its chest. The warlord fell backward, knocking down the line of squires and unintentionally pushing the shaman. This caused the magic to spiral out of control. Now, fireballs were falling randomly all over the battlefield. The place had turned into hell. The magical fire burned and melted everything it touched. The enemy army began to dwindle on its own. Richard smiled, pleased that he had made the savages attack themselves. The kobold ruler ran to the fallen werewolf, desperate. With no other option, the kobold asked the shaman for help. Without answering, the wizard began a new spell. Meanwhile, Richard's army had already practically won. But then Richard noticed something strange. The dead savages began to writhe, groan, and rise. The protagonist was perplexed. It was blood magic. Snorting and staggering, entire rows of dead enemies came back to life. In less than a minute, they were already charging at the barbarians. With no choice, the protagonist drew his sword. He attacked the first undead creature. With a flurry of blows, Richard brought down the zombie werewolf. Before it could even breathe, another one attacked with a club. Richard dodged and repeated the move. It was blows flying everywhere, limbs flying and precise cuts. Richard advanced like a hot knife through butter. His barbarians were not far behind, especially Gunther, who led by example. Advancing relentlessly, Richard finally reached the enemy command. The kobold ruler froze in fear. Seeing that Richard wasn't going to attack immediately, the kobold threw the shaman over his shoulder and tried to flee. Richard wasn't going to let it go easily. He took off his helmet and threw it forcefully into the fleeing man's back. The shaman screamed and fell. Richard approached with a wicked grin. The shaman, still dazed, looked at the protagonist in fear. Shortly after, with the shaman and the kobold captured, Richard returned to his people. Gunther reported the losses and showed the barbarians who needed urgent help. Hearing this, Richard threw the shaman to the ground and demanded his help. The sorcerer introduced himself as Model, a woman, and timidly said that she had been forced to fight against them. Richard wasn't in the mood for idle chatter. Afraid of making the protagonist angrier, Model began the treatment quickly. He whispered a few words, made some gestures, and the wounded barbarian regained consciousness. Strength returned to his body and the wound closed before everyone's eyes. The barbarians were speechless at the miracle. Model finished breathlessly, saying she was exhausted. Richard saw value in her. Her skills were useful for more than just destruction. So they resolved the battlefield issue. Richard ordered the trophies to be collected and the survivors enslaved. He gained so much experience and points that notifications from the system kept arriving, one after another. There was so much going on that that Richard couldn't even process it all. Gunther interrupted, asking what to do with Model. Richard handed her and the kobold over to the barbarian and ordered them both interrogated. The day ended and night fell. Richard refocused on the system, taking the opportunity to improve Heather's skills. As usual, someone barged into his room. It was Heather, warning him that the prisoners weren't talking. Richard smiled and decided to go there personally and teach them how it's done. In the dungeon, Model was pleased to see the protagonist and asked him to get the barbarians out of there. But Richard went straight to the questions. Model played hard to get and said she wasn't going to say anything. The protagonist sighed. A second later, he punched her. Heather was shocked by the productive interrogation method. Richard lifted Model off the ground and asked the question again. Afraid of being beaten again, this time Model told everything. At the same time, Richard discovered that, during the battle, he had killed all the warriors that the kobold ruler had gathered. He accepted the shaman's explanation, but warned her, if it was a lie, the punishment would be severe. Model, almost crying, swore that she was telling the absolute truth. Richard changed the subject to spells. Model, trying to prove herself, boasted about being the best fire mage, but she explained that each shaman had a unique power. Hearing this, Richard concluded that these savages were indeed dangerous. He called Heather to accompany him, but first he needed to resolve the problem of the prisoners. Out of nowhere, Richard ordered them both buried alive. Model panicked and shouted, saying he could be useful. The protagonist asked how. Trembling and stammering, Model spoke about what she had discovered in the mountain fortress. She pointed to the two ogres that Richard had captured earlier, saying that they were trainable. She assured him that they had high magical potential and asked for a chance to transform those stupid ogres into something more, teaching them shamanism. Richard agreed. About 2 days had passed since that conversation in the dungeon. Work in the region was in full swing. The captured slaves worked until they were exhausted. Richard watched the progress from afar. The plan was to use the materials from the destroyed fortress to build a new, much better one. He already envisioned an imposing castle there, but first, he needed to secure the area. Richard asked if Heather was ready to hunt down what was left of the enemies. Laughing, he gave the mission to Heather herself. It was a test of loyalty for the centaurs. Besides, he commented that she and the herd seemed much faster now. Heather looked at her own hooves, confirming that she had felt a strange lightness lately. Richard told her to come back if things got bad. With the mission given, Heather and her people set off for reconnaissance. With that resolved, Richard went to visit the shaman. The scene shifted to the nearby forest, where the ogres were training. Basically, they were breaking trees with impressive skill, but that was all. Model looked at them sadly. Richard appeared behind her, noticing that progress was slow. Model wasn't very happy with the visit, nor with the way she was being treated. Tired of it all, she decided to demonstrate in practice how to cast spells on the ogres. Suddenly, the behavior of one of the ogres changed. He waved his arms strangely, stamped his foot, and the tone of his skin changed. It was exactly the effect Model wanted. The ogre had become immune to wind magic. It was still limited, but Richard saw no reason to complain. Even with basic magic, armored ogres would be useful. The conversation was interrupted when Annie appeared. The protagonist turned around, pleased to see her. The elf's path had crossed Richard's again. He went to the cart and saw that it was full of coal. Richard was curious. Annie explained that it was for the dwarves, gnomes. Trading with them was very lucrative, since she supplied iron and they paid well. She explained where their wealth came from. The dwarves from a nearby region had discovered an extremely rich mine. While they were talking, an eagle landed on Richard's arm, carrying a letter. It was a summons from the ruler of the neighboring city, calling all the aristocrats to an urgent meeting. At that moment, Heather arrived. Richard hadn't expected the centaurs to return so quickly. Heather was silent for a moment, bowed, and reported the savages were no longer any danger. But she brought gruesome news. She had found a mountain of dwarf corpses. She couldn't say what or who had killed them. The protagonist interrupted her, suggesting it was some kind of monster. Heather was surprised by the accurate guess. But it wasn't guesswork. Richard had just read about this threat in the letter he received. Richard, however, had no intention of running from the danger. Annie wanted to know what the next step was, but the protagonist only hinted that the deal with the elf was still in place, meaning the coal needed to be delivered. Annie was stunned, unable to understand Richard's logic. Shortly after, he took her to visit the camp. Once there, he showed her the forge. The protagonist openly admitted that he had started making his own weapons. Walking a little further, they reached Gunther. The barbarian was ready to present the chief with a special weapon. Full of anticipation, Richard grasped the end of the cloth covering the object. In a swift movement, he pulled the cover away, surprising everyone. The people stared at the metal tube, a cannon, without quite understanding what it was. The hours passed and day turned turned into night. At the spot where they found the dead dwarves, the crows were having a feast. Heather took Richard there to see something. Examining the area, they found gigantic footprints. Heather deduced that there were a large number of bear men around. She knew that if she had encountered them before training, she would have had to run. Once again, Richard was glad he had invested in the centaurs. Otherwise, they would have suffered the same cruel fate as the dwarves. Meanwhile, he ordered the barbarians to search the belongings of the dead. The inspection was quick. The barbarians reported that everything had been stolen. Annie commented that the bear men were known for leaving nothing behind. But Richard disagreed. While looking at one of the stalls, something caught his eye. He bent down near a container that still had a liquid inside. Without thinking twice, he dipped his finger in and tasted it. Annie explained that it was a type of soy liqueur that dwarves knew how to make. Richard smiled. That sauce would be perfect for the restaurant he was planning. The elf just sighed, finding it ridiculous. Since it was already dark, Richard decided to camp right there, in the camp of the dead dwarves. Rudo found it strange, thinking they had only gone there for reconnaissance. Richard confirmed this, but said he didn't have the right to leave without seeing the enemy's face. They lit a bonfire. Sitting near the fire, Annie reflected on the problem of the bear men and asked Richard what he thought about it all. The protagonist began to explain the reasons for the war. Iron ore. He knew that all the factions wanted these resources, and, of course, Richard considered himself worthy of taking it all for himself. He said he would be happy to have Annie as a partner and assured her that his military power had greatly increased. The barbarians confirmed their readiness for battle. Besides them, Richard had prepared a battery of artillery, not to mention the magical support of Model and the ogres. He compensated for the lack of numbers with sheer skill. Even so, the elf seemed skeptical. The protagonist was willing to cooperate, but in reality he only wanted to get closer to the dwarves. In the end, Annie signed the cooperation agreement. Shortly after, Richard gathered his army. He gave a fiery speech, comparing himself and his soldiers to a sharp sword that always brings victory. The barbarians shouted in approval. Later, the scene shifted to the vicinity of the dwarves' castle. Under the cover of night, Richard's army approached silently. Suddenly, Richard stopped the troop. He sensed something was wrong. Bubbles began to rise in a nearby lake. A moment later, strange creatures emerged from the water. The protagonist thought he had fallen into a trap. The barbarians prepared their weapons immediately, except that the rabbits completely ignored Richard. For some reason, they went straight to the dwarves' fortress. Richard didn't understand anything. What did rabbits have to do with it? Annie suggested they might have made an alliance with the bearmen. The protagonist nodded in agreement, accepting the theory. Heather opined that the bearmen must be using the rabbits as cannon fodder. It turns out that Richard was the only one who hadn't imagined that such alliances existed. To vent his frustration, he gave Model a smack on the head, trying to explain to the shaman that she should have hidden better instead of relying on her size. Meanwhile, the rabbits continued climbing the walls. A minute later, they climbed the walls in absolute silence. A dwarf guard, who had been dozing off, glanced to the side, half asleep. He came face to face with a grinning rabbit, its dagger already raised. The fright was widespread and the alarm sounded. The night attack caught the dwarves by surprise, who rushed to prepare their siege weapons. The fight was going to be ugly. Upon receiving the order, the dwarves fired their scorpions, giant ballistas. The heavy arrows flew, grazing the rabbits' heads. Even under attack, the invaders did not retreat. Other groups threw ladders across the moat. The dwarves opened the gates and came out for direct confrontation. The rabbits weren't afraid and were ready for a fight. But then, a loud bang echoed and an unknown force threw rabbits everywhere. Their commander looked around, completely bewildered. It was Richard's artillery, which had taken up position and opened fire. The leader of the rabbits pointed at the barbarians and ordered them to attack. What he didn't know was that there were many more of Richard's men hidden in the bushes. Richard led the attack and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Gunther followed closely behind, protecting his chief's back. On the flanks, the barbarians advanced in a wide line. The rabbits had no chance of winning, but they resisted due to their sheer numbers. Suddenly, heavy footsteps made the ground tremble. Richard stopped fighting, searching for the source of the noise. A giant shadow covered the protagonist. Something tall and strong focused its gaze on him. A beastly roar erupted, and a huge bear man stopped in front of Richard. The monster raised its arm to strike. At the last second, Richard reacted and blocked. He survived, but the force of the impact was so brutal that it threw him backward. Breathing heavily, Richard recognized that the beast was indeed strong. The bear roared again, and more companions appeared beside him, along with the rabbits, who returned to the fight. The centaurs responded with a hail of arrows. The battle entered a new and bloody phase. Taking Taking advantage of the surprise, another squadron of rabbits emerged from the river and attacked the flank of Richard's army. Wanting to be helpful, Shaman Model began to prepare her magic. After a long incantation, she summoned a ball of fire. Shining brightly, she aimed at the heart of the enemy army. The magic exploded and engulfed several opponents. But that wasn't the only surprise Richard had up his sleeve. The ogres, magically awakened, also showed their worth. From the fortress, the patriarch of the dwarves, Lobby, watched everything without a word. He thought that unexpected help was divine intervention. One of the dwarves asked permission to come down and help the allies, but Lobby refused. The patriarch found it more important to protect his own people and leave the glory of battle to others. Meanwhile, the enemy army attempted to regroup. Richard decided it was time to break their morale. Using the system, he summoned a magical vortex. The whirlwind swept across the battlefield, sucking in and encircling the enemy. The defensive lines broke again, and Richard gave the signal for a new attack. He aimed his sword directly at the obvious leader of the bearmen. But taking down the big guy wasn't easy. Richard attacked again, activating a new power. With a shout, a brilliant magic enveloped his sword. Seeing that, the bearman froze. A second later, Richard cut the monster in half. The system warned instantly, a shower of experience for the protagonist. Even the ogres began to use their magical potential to their full potential. Terrified by the fiery breath, the bearmen didn't see Gunther approaching. But suddenly, the weapon slipped from her hand. The barbarian was thrown to the ground and given a violent kick, rolling down the slope. This did not go unnoticed. Furious, a barbarian threw his axe at the bearman, who easily repelled the attack. But the bear didn't celebrate victory for long. Using the invisibility of one of the ogres, Richard got close to him unseen. Seconds later, the bear was on the ground and all the important characters rushed to see how Gunther was. Luckily, the barbarian survived thanks to her special technique. Gunther wasted no time and thanked Richard for the incredible battle. But there wasn't much time to celebrate. Something strange began to happen in the middle of the battlefield. A reddish mist covered the fallen bodies, and suddenly they came back to life. Not even the shaman model quite understood what was happening. It was the berserker spell. This meant that there were shamans on the attacker's side, and usually only the Minotaur tribe used this magic. Something needs to be explained here. These Minotaurs lived on the outskirts of the empire. Besides their brute strength, they relied heavily on magic, but they almost never managed to control it and ended up going mad. This madness made them almost invincible and very cruel in battle. That's why they were called Bloody Hooves. Back in reality, the enemy army attacked under the spell's influence, their eyes red and their screams incessant. Richard hesitated for a moment, but Model assured him that the Minotaur shaman hadn't cast the spell completely. This reassured Richard and gave him an opening. Gunther, recovered, led the barbarians. They quickly broke through the berserkers' defenses and began to decimate the enemy. Richard gave a clear order: do not kill the fallen or those who fled. With the battle over, Richard decided to visit the dwarves. He made his way as fast as possible to the walls of the technological castle, but Patriarch Lobby shouted for them not to dare approach. Richard introduced himself, shouting, and Annie had to intervene, reminding the dwarves who they were. Hearing the elf's voice, Lobby softened his tone and opened the gates for them. Annie introduced Richard to the Patriarch. Lobby nodded and suggested they talk inside, but Richard was annoyed that the dwarf hadn't immediately thanked him for the victory. He chose to ignore the gesture. Even so, Lobby had to admit that the dwarves wouldn't have held out alone. Hearing this, Richard chuckled. The dwarf frowned, thinking the human was mocking him. Richard quickly clarified that this was not the case, and Annie had to calm them down. Lobby commented that Richard had a strong spirit, but the protagonist made it clear that he wasn't interested in such mystical matters. The dwarf scratched his beard, perplexed by the fact that this knight, as he called Richard, didn't care about his spirit. Richard almost laughed at the title of knight, as he didn't see himself that way. Annie changed the subject to the imminent danger. Lobby sighed and confirmed that the enemies would return, but suggested they rest first. Richard agreed, and the Patriarch offered them empty houses to sleep in. Then, Annie apologized for the dwarf leader's rudeness. Richard wasn't offended. He wasn't proud, but he told Annie that he thought Lobby was a weak leader. The elf criticized Richard for seeing the world in too much black and white terms. He didn't argue. He simply said that, when faced with an enemy, there's no other option but to fight, and wished him good night. The night was tense for the gnomes, who feared the return of the monsters. Meanwhile, in his room, Richard was talking to Heather. The centaur was complaining that the ceiling was too low for her when, suddenly, they felt a vibration. Richard jumped, thinking it was an earthquake, but no, it was war trumpets. The dwarves rushed to the walls with their weapons, but but when they arrived, they were surprised. Richard's people were already ready for battle. Richard looked back and called out to the patriarch in a mocking tone. Lobby didn't like the attitude, because dwarves weren't cowards. Then the protagonist warned. Minotaurs had appeared. Richard looked back and called out to the patriarch in a mocking tone. Lobby didn't like the attitude, because dwarves weren't cowards. Then the protagonist warned. Minotaurs had appeared. But the dwarves were not afraid, they knew a trick. The minotaurs were prisoners of their own height and would have difficulty moving there. Stepping forward, the dwarves decided to take the first blow. Richard watched them leave, while his followers joked about the dwarves' height. Night fell, and at one point, it began to rain. The dwarves prepared for battle, but the mood was one of pure pessimism. These listless conversations were cut short immediately. Furthermore, a new enemy army was rapidly approaching. Richard was already eager to capture some savages and sell them in the arena afterward. Of course, the protagonist knew that doing this would be difficult. Some dwarves overheard part of this conversation and, very quickly, Richard's reputation changed from brave to crazy. While there was still time, the dwarves hoped Richard would use his artillery fire again. But the protagonist offered no guarantees, because the element of surprise had worked the previous time. The situation was complicated, as the dwarves themselves were low on ammunition. Then the armies clashed. The first ranks of dwarves were swept away in an instant. The giant creatures tossed the soldiers aside as if they were toys. With few arrows left for their ballistae, the dwarves fired fewer, but with much greater accuracy. The bearmen and minotaurs didn't even waste time with the common soldiers. They went straight for the castle walls. When they reached the right distance, the dwarves fired their ballistae. They pulled the levers and the giant arrows flew. With focused effort, they began to hit the monsters. They suffered casualties, but that didn't stop them. The pain only fueled their anger. Little by little, the dwarves were losing ground. Laubi was terrified, thinking it was the end. Seeing all this, Gunther thought Richard should intervene. That's when Richard remembered his magic squad. It turns out Model had tried to escape amidst the chaos, but was caught. Richard was indignant at the shaman's attempt to escape at such a critical moment. Almost crying, Model admitted that she was afraid of the monsters. Richard scolded her, reminding her how powerful her magic was. Listening to the conversation, Laubi wished that Model would use his magic. Richard took the opportunity to warn that he would collect the attempted escape as a debt. He ordered Model to use the spell, but Laubi was shocked. The protagonist asked to use bloodlust on the monsters. The shaman said the plan was sick, but Richard wouldn't listen and demanded obedience. With no choice, Model began the ritual. Moments later, the magic beam struck the monsters. Richard's plan was audacious, to use one spell to neutralize the power of another. Meanwhile, the monsters became more brutal than ever. Their muscles swelled, almost bursting with madness. Richard yelled at Model not to stop and to finish the spell. She went all the way. Magical streams descended from the sky and struck the creatures' backs. Now, in addition to rage, they were consumed by bloodlust. The dwarves were terrified by the enemy's new appearance. At that moment, one of the minotaurs grabbed its own head and let out a deafening roar. In a panic, the gnomes ran in all directions. Model broke down in tears, blaming Richard for the loss of control and saying that everyone was going to die. But the protagonist saw the situation differently. With that newfound strength, an absurd burden was placed upon the hearts of the beasts. Richard knew that, in that state, the monsters were invulnerable on the outside. But inside, their hearts were literally exploding because of the brutal increase in muscle mass. Richard was just waiting for that limit to be reached. Suddenly, just as the protagonist had predicted, one of the minotaurs collapsed to the ground. Gunther held his breath. No one had imagined that this crazy plan would work. A minute later, the minotaurs fell dead, one after the other. Seeing this, Laubi demanded to know the secret of the victory. Richard just shrugged, saying it was the limit of their physical abilities. In fact, one spell overloaded the other, and that's what destroyed the minotaurs. Laubi celebrated the victory, understanding more or less what had happened. The minotaurs were defeated by their own strength. Richard was thinking the same thing as he observed the bodies. For the first time, the dwarf patriarch looked at the protagonist with genuine respect. Richard chuckled and asked everyone to calm down. It was then that Model, who was already boasting about having cast the spell, opened her mouth. The protagonist leaned towards her and reminded her that she was only working to pay for the escape attempt. And he continued to scold her, harsher and harsher. Richard didn't mince words. He bluntly called Model a coward, saying she wanted to run away at the first sign of danger. To top it off, he called the shaman useless if she couldn't overcome her own fears. The insult was harsh, but Model didn't dare utter a peep in response. Shortly after, Richard went down to see the dead minotaurs. He lamented that that none had survived. But at least that victory guaranteed him and the dwarves a few days off. He knew very well that, sooner or later, the monsters would return to take their revenge. So, he focused his attention on the bolts, those giant arrows, that the dwarves had made. He picked one up, examined it, and was certain, with that weapon he could defeat anyone. But Richard wanted to arm his troops even better. Lobby, the leader of the dwarves, was somewhat hesitant, saying that they made arrows easily, but they didn't have any ready-made ballistae. That's when another dwarf appeared, wanting to show Richard something. He led the protagonist to one of the firing towers. The ceiling was too low for a human, but Richard pressed on. The dwarf grabbed the end of a cloth covering something and pulled. A new ballista appeared before Richard's eyes. He stared at the machine, holding his breath. The dwarf didn't boast. He said it was a racial secret and was honest about the weapon's deadly range. Richard was convinced that nothing would survive it, but the dwarf wasn't happy. The ballista had a serious defect in the bowstring. Because of the imperfect material, the rope frequently broke. The dwarf mentioned using a special leech, but never found one. Richard recalled that these creatures truly possessed a unique elasticity, but achieving that was difficult. After thinking for a while, Richard changed the subject and started talking about gold. Lobby became suspicious, thinking he was going to sell the leeches, but Richard said he had no intention of selling anything. Richard opened the system and commented on dragon veins, which centaurs used in their bows. He could buy them through the system, but made it clear that he was completely broke. Lobby saw the advantage and said that gold was no problem. Richard smiled and ordered all the gold to be brought as quickly as possible. The order was given, and the dwarves rushed to work, whispering amongst themselves about the Lord's true intentions. They had doubts about Richard's nobility, but no one wanted to refuse his help. After all, he was the strongest in the fortress and, in practice, their savior. While the dwarves prepared the ballista, Lobby spoke to Richard again. The patriarch was afraid that if the battle lasted too long, the rope wouldn't hold. Richard looked at him and asked if he was afraid of losing. Lobby said no. His fear was of the war itself, because many of his dwarf friends had already died. The protagonist then suggested a clever tactic: retreat and leave the fortress for the savages to fight over the iron or later. But Lobby refused immediately. Trembling slightly, the dwarf revealed the fortress protected much more than just iron ore. Richard was curious, having no idea what it could be. Lobby spoke of something within the lake, something the dwarves valued more than life itself, a most important secret. Later, the dwarves held a meeting to decide whether to tell the humans their secret. There was much discussion, with fears that Richard would abandon them as soon as he found out. Suddenly, a dwarf stood up and reminded everyone that it was Richard who had repelled 2 attacks by the savages. Gradually, the others agreed. A more skeptical dwarf still tried to argue against it, but Lobby spoke up. He pleaded for common sense, reminding them that the dwarves couldn't handle the threats alone. Richard was their only hope. The scene shifted to the lake. The ogres Richard had enslaved were there, doing something strange. They grunted, gestured, and touched the grass and earth, which seemed to grow healthier. Richard wasn't very impressed with the little show, but Annie and Model defended the ogres, assuring them that those skills were useful. Richard delivered the message to the shaman. It would be good for her to train the ogres properly, for her own health. Shortly after, a group of dwarves came to fetch the protagonist. They put a breathing helmet on him and took him to a flooded cave. No one knows how long they swam after the dwarves. Suddenly, gigantic chained hands appeared in front of them. Richard raised his gaze until he came face to face with a legendary titan. Finally, he understood the great secret the dwarves were keeping. They swam toward the giant. As they touched his body, the titan's eyes lit up. Richard was shocked, realizing that the creature sensed their presence. Half an hour later, already on the surface of the lake, the dwarves admitted they hadn't expected that reaction. The dwarf explained that this titan was the ancestor of all dwarves. Richard almost laughed, finding it impossible. To prove it, the dwarf plunged his hands into the water again. Down there, the titan opened his eyes and the surface glowed. The story was this: titans were ancient and powerful magical beings, but they had become extinct. Richard asked why they didn't take him away from there. The dwarf explained that the titan was trapped in an iron core. Without it, he would die, and mining in the area was causing the light in his eyes to weaken. Everything started to make sense in Richard's mind. The dwarf explained that the titan was active and at the peak of its power during the full moon. The dwarves believed that the moon fueled the creature with energy and, according to ancient books, they wanted to inherit that power. But until now, they had never succeeded. With the next full moon approaching, they planned to try again. Richard smiled, understanding the plan. The dwarves told everything because they were afraid the titan's power would be lost. If they failed, they offered to transfer that power to Richard, but the protagonist wasn't very enthusiastic about the idea. He didn't want to risk his own life or that of his men, so he hoped the dwarves could handle everything on their own. In any case, it was time to go back. Before leaving, the dwarves asked for absolute secrecy, especially from the elf Annie. Richard promised to remain as silent as a fish. An hour later, he returned to his barbarians. He lied, saying he had accidentally fallen into the lake. Gunther handed him a towel and warned that the rest of the group had gone with Annie to watch the ogre's training. The protagonist nodded, secretly hoping the dwarves' plan would succeed, but the peace was short-lived. The sound of Heather's hooves echoed through the area. The centaur arrived, warning that they had serious problems. The enemy army was returning to the fortress, and this time they were far more numerous. Richard sighed. The timing couldn't be worse, but deep down, he was glad that battle was inevitable. The hour of the battle was drawing near. Trumpets sounded on the walls. The dwarves, with renewed spirits, banged on their shields, asking for the blessing of their god. Far away, the commander of the new army of savages watched everything. He thought resistance was futile and ordered the fortress to be destroyed before sunset. The signal to attack was given. Lobby was sad because his attempt to obtain the Titan's power had failed again. Richard had to give him a reality check, reminding him that the dwarves needed their leader now. The savage army began to march quickly. The dwarves closed the shield wall, bracing for impact, while the roar of the enemies grew ever closer. But the defenders saw an opportunity in this. Allowing the enemy to get to the ideal distance, Richard gave the order. The ballistas fired at full force. The centaur's arrows whistled through the air. The enemy army suffered its first casualties even before getting close. Soon after, the hand-to-hand combat really began. From the walls, Model unleashed his magic. From the midst of the clouds, fireballs began to rain down on the battlefield. Chaos reigned. Taking advantage of the confusion, Richard charged forward with his men. His target was the larger savages. With a precise blow, he severed the arm of a bear man. The ruler of the savages saw the scene and rushed to avenge his brother. With a single swing of his giant mallet, he hurled Richard away. Gunther watched the scene, worried. Luckily, Richard survived. Even slightly wounded, he had to admit, the king of the bearmen was skilled. The monster twirled his weapon and said he was going to take the aristocrat's life. His arrogance infuriated Richard. The protagonist charged forward, taking down anyone who got in his way. The massacre continued for a while until the dust settled, revealing a terrible scene. Gunther tried to warn Richard that the barbarian forces were weakening. Hearing this, the protagonist hurriedly checked the system. For the first time, he saw that he had suffered heavy losses. And what was worse, the savages didn't care about their own deaths and continued pushing back against the front line. Richard decided to retreat to the dwarves' castle. Protected by the centaur's arrows, the allies retreated. The weather turned and a heavy rain began to fall. The dwarves could barely stand. Their injuries were severe, and many did not respond to treatment. Richard became furious when he saw Lobby wasting time mourning the dead. He went over, grabbed the patriarch by the beard, and demanded that he act like a leader. Lobby wiped away his tears and agreed. Even so, the protagonist himself felt a pang in his chest watching the ranks of dwarves dwindle. Suddenly, Annie appeared, wanting to know the situation. Somewhat rudely, Richard went straight to the point. The final attack on the city had begun. Annie could clearly hear the sound of the swords clashing, interrupted now and then by the brutal pounding of the battering ram against the gate. Richard ordered the ogres to help the dwarves hold the fort. Using magic, they temporarily transformed the wooden gate into stone. But the invaders didn't just stand there waiting. They put up ladders and began to climb the walls. The dwarves were caught off guard again. What had been a balanced fight turned into a massacre. Model ran to Richard to warn him that the situation was dire. The protagonist hadn't expected things to go wrong so quickly and began scolding the shaman for not using magic to stop the enemies. Sighing, Model blamed the rain, which was nullifying her fire magic. Meanwhile, the fortress gate gave way and collapsed. Spears and axes began to fly through the hole, followed by the savages. Richard ran to the invasion point. A second later, Lobby arrived, with no more than 100 dwarves remaining. The protagonist paused for a moment, thinking about how to turn the tables. The calculation was simple. Each one would have to kill at least 100 savages. But first, Richard decided to cause havoc. He led the charge against the invaders. Gunther followed him without hesitation. Richard set the example, cutting mercilessly with his sword. Whoever crossed his path met their death. King Bear saw the protagonist again and ordered everyone to focus on him. A new wave of savages advanced. Richard was tense, but it seemed he had been expecting exactly this. The next moment, he cast a spell. Magic charged his sword, and he plunged it forcefully into the ground. Gunther grinned. grinned, watching the savages being electrocuted and fried until they turned golden. It was Richard's moment of triumph, a pure display of power. But there was still a problem. No matter how bravely the dwarves fought, they were retreating. Gunther warned Richard about this. The protagonist looked back, shocked, and made a drastic decision. He demanded that Model use the bloodlust spell on the dwarves. The shaman obeyed immediately. Urged on by Richard, she cast the spell quickly. Magical rays struck the dwarves' bodies. Next, Richard ordered the ogres to spring into action to provide support. It was just then that a new wave of savages descended upon the defenders, killing them. But then the unexpected happened. A savage struck a dwarf on the head and the sword, it broke on his forehead. Fueled by bloodlust, the dwarves retaliated furiously. Hammers and axes flew everywhere. The savages hadn't expected such absurd resistance. In a few minutes, the balance of the battle shifted completely. Seeing this, King Bear called for reinforcements to stop the dwarves' advance. But Richard was faster and ordered the ogres to cut off the enemy's path. One of the ogres slammed his palm on the ground with all his might. Gigantic roots sprouted from the depths, creating a dense barrier that trapped the savages. Getting past that wall of roots was nearly impossible. King Bear cursed, acknowledging Richard's cleverness. The protagonist smiled contentedly. He had managed to break through the enemy army. He jumped onto the back of another ogre and ordered him to use invisibility. The ogre obeyed and moved silently among the roots. Thanks to this, Richard managed to get very close to the Bear King without being noticed. At a crucial moment, the protagonist caught his attention, and before the monster could react, Richard pierced him with his sword. King Bear only had time to scream in pain. Richard bid him farewell with mockery. In front of everyone, the enemy leader staggered and collapsed dead. With the king's death, the morale of the wildling army plummeted. The news spread, and they began to flee in desperation. Richard's troops pursued them. Now, the savages were being slaughtered without mercy. Richard merely grumbled, disappointed, admitting that their fighting spirit was very weak. The enormous horde retreated, running away from the dwarves' fortress. The day ended and night fell. Even at the cost of much blood, dwarves and humans achieved a decisive victory. Richard was the only one who saw the advantage in all of this. Thanks to the experience gained in battle, he managed to significantly improve the level of his troops. But he had to pause the distribution of points when Lobby arrived. Richard noticed that the dwarf was dressed in a strange, unnatural way. The dwarves explained quickly. It was a full moon. The right time had come. Luckily, Richard remembered what they had talked about before. Even with their recent losses, the dwarves weren't going to let this chance pass. Lobby hoped luck would be on his side that night. He was obsessed with mastering the Titan's power. The night wore on, and the full moon emerged from behind the clouds. Along with the dwarves, the protagonist went to the lake. Before anything else, they decided to drain the water. The wizards began the work. The magic created a whirlpool, and the water gradually receded, revealing the Titan at the bottom. Richard was awestruck by the sight. The time for the ceremony had arrived. Lobby signaled for the candidates to begin. One by one, the dwarves gathered at the edge of the water. Waving small branches, they began the ritual. Shaman Model quickly explained to Richard that it was a good luck ritual. She thought it was pointless, but she knew that older generations believed in such things. At the same time, Model said that dance could transmit important knowledge. Of course, the protagonist listened to everything without much enthusiasm. Suddenly, a trumpet sounded. A circle of fire appeared on the ground. Soon after, the first dwarf entered the circle. He knelt, ready to use his own blood as a bond. For Richard's information, the shaman commented that this method might work. Furthermore, if it failed, the poor fellow could even explode. Richard felt a chill and was grateful he wasn't one of the candidates. But time passed and the Titan did not react. The first candidate left and another took his place. They did everything exactly the same. Then another dwarf came, and yet another entered the circle of fire. Lobby was saddened because everyone had failed. A noble dwarf even prayed to the Titan to bless his descendants, but it was all in vain. Disappointment gripped the dwarves. In the end, they let the protagonist try his luck. Richard hesitated. After all, he wasn't a dwarf. After some persuasion, he agreed to the experiment. Stepping into the circle of fire, Richard tried to mimic the dwarves' movements. Suddenly, there was a reaction. The Titan's eyes gleamed and the giant stirred. Bright cracks appeared on its body. The glow intensified, and the Titan's structure began to crumble. Richard was startled, thinking the Titan was going to explode. The dwarves froze, stunned. But instead of an explosion, something emerged from that intense glow. As the Titan disintegrated, a small animal emerged from one of its eyes. The strange creature began to squeak, seemingly confused about where it was or why. Richard didn't understand understand what that creature had to do with the Titan. The dwarves, however, recognized it immediately. That noisy creature was their ancestor. While Richard watched, Model was already thinking about what the baby would taste like if he devoured it. The little animal began to run quickly across the Titan's body. The dwarves became hysterical, worried about its safety. Richard could only admire the creature's agility. Using its claws, the animal descended very quickly. Suddenly, the Titan's body jerked, propelling the creature forward. By accident, or on purpose, it jumped into the hand of one of the ogres. The cute little face looked straight into the ogre's eyes. But, out of nowhere, the little animal was firmly grabbed by another person. It was Richard, who began to examine the creature carefully. The dwarves ran towards him, demanding that he return the baby. At that very moment, the animal began to release electric shocks. The protagonist realized immediately that things were about to get ugly. Richard acted quickly. He tossed the little animal into the hands of the dwarves, who were already charmed by it. Immediately afterwards, there was an explosion. The result? The dwarves looked like they had been electrocuted and were exhausted. Richard chuckled and explained that the creature had absorbed some of the Titan's magic. Suddenly, a dwarf pointed at the giant. In front of everyone, the Titan's body literally began to crumble. The dwarves sighed sadly, understanding that the Titan's mission was accomplished. He had left the earth and, after centuries, was returning to it. Seeing the giant being destroyed, the little animal let out a long squeal, "Chew!" Without a second thought, Richard decided to name the creature Chew because of the noise it made. The night passed and a new day began. Several loaded wagons moved through the wildlands. Seated opposite the protagonist, Annie didn't understand Richard's haste to reach his fortress. The aristocrat only assured her that the elf would receive her share. Annie quickly realized that something had transpired between him and the dwarves, but Richard tried to deflect the conversation. That's when the little animal appeared behind him. Annie froze for a second, but soon broke into a curious smile at the sight of the cute Chewbacca. Without hiding anything, Richard revealed that the dwarves initially wanted to keep the animal. As he spoke, he opened a bottle of milk. It turned out that, without Richard around, Chew refused to eat. The journey continued, and about 2 days later, they arrived at their destination. Richard paid Annie what he owed and said goodbye to her for a while. Without waiting long, the protagonist decided to go and meet an important nobleman. His name was Sauron, a famous lord. They exchanged a few jokes, and it turned out that Sauron himself was looking for a meeting with Richard. This was a surprise. The lord quickly explained that he needed to have a serious conversation, and furthermore, Sauron boasted of having brought a special delicacy for the occasion. The protagonist thought the attitude was cool until he saw the food. When the exotic delicacy was shown, Richard almost vomited in disgust, but tried to hide it. During the idle chatter, Chew jumped from somewhere straight into the protagonist's hands. Richard, of course, always enjoyed the animal's company. The little animal handed a nut to the protagonist. Richard easily cracked the shell and, in a swift movement, threw the seed into his own mouth. Chew was confused because he was expecting to receive the treat, not for his owner to eat it. Sauron commented on the animal, saying he felt strong magical vibrations emanating from it. Richard explained that he was a descendant of the Titans. After that, Richard stuffed Chew with nuts and told him to call the cook. The creature swallowed everything in an instant and ran off to the kitchen. Soon after, Sauron's delicacy was frying in the oil. While they ate, Richard thanked Sauron for the help he had given them in the past. The Lord smiled. He was ready to explain the reason for his help. Richard was already expecting one of those boring political speeches, and that's exactly what happened. Sauron began to talk about the state of the Empire. He explained that 2 factions controlled everything. Richard vaguely remembered this. The 2 used religion in different ways. One followed higher powers, and the other worshipped the elements. The followers of the higher powers had a great deal of influence. But, since the Empire was vast and full of natural disasters, the worshippers of the elements were also very strong in various regions. Hearing this, Richard concluded that the Lord must have joined one of the factions. Sauron laughed and said that, as a wizard, he did not believe in gods. Sauron explained that wizards need to question beliefs and focus on the mind and scientific knowledge. Richard thought it best to remain silent. After a pause, the protagonist decided to be honest and said that he himself had never believed in anything. Sauron replied immediately, "That's exactly why I like you." Richard was shocked. It began to seem as though Sauron wanted to drag Richard into a third faction. The Lord did not deny it. Richard grimaced in disgust at that moment. The protagonist completely refused to join a group that would be an enemy of both dominant factions at the same time. But Sauron didn't insist. On the contrary, he suggested that, if a war broke out, Richard should choose the side of the church, higher powers. The protagonist protagonist calmed down a little, but without understanding the logic behind it. Sauron began to show 3 types of coins from the Empire. While organizing everything, he explained the complexities of currency exchange and, out of nowhere, changed the subject to anatomy, saying that everyone has the same number of fingers. It seemed like a riddle that Richard was trying to decipher. The Lord spoke of an elemental goddess with many wings and concluded that the Church of the Elements had far more followers than any other faction. Richard picked up one of the coins from the table and realized the play. With his intervention, he could tip the balance of power. After much conversation and food, the aristocrats' meeting ended. Richard suspected that Sauron hadn't just shown up for a chat. He thought the Lord was testing the waters. And Sauron admitted he had gone there to check out the rumors about Richard. He said the visit was a privilege. Richard took it in stride. Once mounted on his horse, Sauron complained about his health and the side effects of the medication he took to live in peace. He left, leaving Richard with difficult choices to make. The story continued. Taking advantage of the calm, Richard rested. But the break ended when Annie returned to the fortress. The elf was speechless. She gazed at the mountain fortress, now rebuilt and imposing, and couldn't believe that this miserable place had changed so much. The success was largely thanks to the ogres, who had unleashed their magical potential. Annie saw the dwarves that Richard had decided to protect and questioned the agreement. The protagonist dodged the question, lying that the deal was made after she left. The elf began to grow irritated by Richard's arrogance and the multitude of servants surrounding him. The protagonist hesitated, unsure what to say. In the end, he feigned compassion for the losers. He almost cried talking about the terrible situation of the dwarves and tried to blame everything on poor Model. The shaman hadn't expected this betrayal. Annie sighed and got straight to business. She called someone over and introduced them as Backland Naturalist. Showing off her cat ears, the naturalist greeted the aristocrat. Richard found her look quite interesting. Annie said she came from a noble clan with good taste in art. The naturalist bowed and asked to be called Tang, the clan's nickname. Richard stifled a laugh, doubting that this tigress could hunt anything. Backland remained silent, visibly confused. Several hours passed. Gunther left with his group to recruit savages. Richard only asked the barbarian not to overdo it and not to go too far. After they left, Richard struck up a conversation with Annie about buying books. Out of nowhere, he was interested in spiritual practices. The conversation was interrupted by a dwarf who appeared behind them. He looked exhausted and was crying with emotion. The blast furnace was ready. This meant that, from now on, Richard could forge his own weapons.